In the spring of 2023, in a quiet suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, a man named Michael Lawson sat across from his wife at their kitchen table and asked her a question that would unravel everything he thought he knew. The clothes in the closet that weren't his, the cash she couldn't explain, the late nights that stretched into early mornings. What started as doubt had become certainty, and what he discovered next would lead not just to the end of a marriage, but to a death that investigators initially couldn't explain. This is the story of a double life so carefully constructed that even the people living closest to it never suspected the truth until it was far too late. A story where love, faith, and betrayal collided in ways that would destroy multiple families and leave investigators chasing shadows for weeks before a single piece of footage changed everything. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. To understand how this case unfolded, we need to go back to the beginning, to the man at the center of it all. Michael Lawson was born in the early 1980s into a devout Christian household, where faith wasn't just practiced on Sundays, it shaped every decision, every relationship, every expectation. His parents were Sabbatarian Christians, a denomination that observes Saturday as the Sabbath, a day of rest and worship rooted in biblical tradition. This wasn't a casual faith. It was a framework, a structure that gave Michael's life meaning and direction. From a young age, he was taught that discipline and righteousness were the pillars of a good life, that temptation was everywhere, and that only through faith could a person resist the pull of sin. Michael absorbed these lessons deeply. He was the kind of boy who didn't question his parents' teachings, who went to church without complaint, who believed that God had a plan for him if he just stayed on the path. But in his early 20s, Michael strayed. He fell in with a group of friends who lived fast, who made money in ways that didn't ask questions, who operated in the shadows of legality. Michael didn't consider himself a criminal, but he participated. He was present during a robbery, one that went wrong in the worst possible way. Someone panicked, a gun was drawn, shots were fired. Michael was hit at point-blank range, the bullet tearing through tissue and bone, collapsing his lung. He was rushed to the hospital, his life balanced on a thread so thin that doctors later told his family they weren't sure he'd make it through the night. But he did. In that hospital bed, with machines breathing for him and pain radiating through every nerve, Michael made a vow. If he survived, if God gave him a second chance, he would never fall back into the life that had almost killed him. He would dedicate himself entirely to faith, to living righteously, to becoming the man his parents had always hoped he'd be. The recovery was long, both physically and spiritually. Michael spent months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again, learning to breathe without assistance, but more than that, learning to rebuild his identity. He returned to church with a fervor he'd never felt before. He studied scripture, attended every service, volunteered in outreach programs. His faith wasn't just renewed, it was transformed into something central, something unshakable. For Michael, God had literally saved his life, and he owed everything to that grace. He became a Sabbatarian Christian not just in name but in practice, observing the Sabbath with strict discipline, refusing work or distractions on Saturdays, dedicating that day entirely to worship and rest. His friends noticed the change. His family was relieved. Michael had become the man he was always meant to be, someone who lived by principle, who wouldn't compromise, who believed that faith and discipline could guide a person through anything. As he moved into his 30s, Michael began thinking seriously about marriage. But for him, this wasn't a casual decision. Marriage was a covenant, a sacred bond that required not just love, but alignment. He needed a partner who shared his values, who understood the importance of faith, who wouldn't pull him back toward the life he'd left behind. He was looking for someone who embodied the same discipline, the same commitment to living righteously. He prayed about it often, asking God to guide him toward the right person, someone who would walk beside him on the narrow path he'd chosen. Michael wasn't interested in fleeting attraction or surface-level connection. He wanted depth, shared purpose, a partnership built on trust and mutual devotion to something greater than themselves. And then, in a way that felt almost divinely orchestrated, he met her. It was a routine visit to a local hospital. Michael's colleague had undergone an appendectomy, A minor surgery, but one that required a few days of recovery. Michael stopped by to check on him, to bring encouragement, to show support. Hospitals were familiar to Michael. He'd spent enough time in them during his own recovery that the smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights didn't bother him. But that day, as he walked through the sterile hallways, something caught his attention. A woman in a nurse's uniform was pushing a cart down the corridor. She moved with quiet grace, her expression calm, her demeanor professional yet warm. There was something about her that made Michael pause. She wasn't just another nurse navigating a busy shift. There was a kindness in her eyes, a gentleness that radiated from her presence. Her name, he would soon learn, was Danielle. Their eyes met for just a moment as she passed. She smiled, a genuine, disarming smile that seemed to light up the dull hallway. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft but confident. Michael nodded, momentarily at a loss for words. As she continued down the hall, he noticed something that made his heart skip. Hanging from beneath her uniform, just barely visible, was a delicate rosary. It was a small detail, but for Michael, it was significant. Here was a woman who didn't just work in healthcare, she carried her faith with her. The rosary wasn't a fashion statement. It was a symbol, a quiet declaration that she lived her life guided by something deeper. Michael felt an immediate connection, not just to her beauty, which was undeniable, but to what that rosary represented. This was someone who shared his values, or so it seemed. He didn't approach her that day. Michael wasn't impulsive, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. The next time he visited his colleague, he made a point to arrive during the same shift. And there she was again, moving through the hospital with the same quiet confidence. This time, they spoke. The conversation was brief, professional at first, but there was an ease between them that felt natural. She mentioned her faith casually, and Michael's heart lifted. They talked about church, about the importance of living a life grounded in God's word, about the challenges of maintaining faith in a world that often seemed hostile to it. By the end of the conversation, Michael was certain. This was the woman he'd been praying for. Danielle seemed to embody everything he valued. She was kind, intelligent, devoted to her faith, and she carried herself with a grace that suggested discipline and purpose. He asked if he could see her again, not at the hospital, but somewhere they could talk more freely. She agreed, and that's how it began. Even after his colleague was discharged, Michael found reasons to return to the hospital. He'd pick Danielle up after her shifts, surprising her with flowers, walking with her through the parking lot under the fading Arizona sun. Their conversations flowed effortlessly. They talked about their childhoods, their faith journeys, their hopes for the future. Danielle shared stories about her work, about the patients she cared for, about the emotional toll of watching people suffer and the joy of seeing them heal. Michael talked about his own past, the darkness he'd come from, the vow he'd made in that hospital bed years ago. Danielle listened with empathy, her eyes soft and understanding. She told him she admired his strength, his commitment to living differently. She said she too believed in second chances, that God's grace was infinite for those who sought it. Every word she spoke seemed to confirm what Michael already felt. This was more than attraction. This was alignment. One evening, as they walked under the stars after Danielle's shift, she playfully teased him. "You know, I dreamt of us getting married last night," she said, her voice light but sincere. Michael's heart raced. He believed in signs, in divine nudges, and this felt like one. Within a few months, Michael proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, heartfelt, rooted in the faith they both claimed to share. He knelt in a church parking lot after a service, holding a modest ring, and asked Danielle to be his wife, to walk the path of faith with him, to build a life grounded in God's word. She said yes without hesitation, her eyes shining with what looked like joy. They married in a small ceremony attended by close family and friends, a union blessed by their pastor, a covenant Michael believed was unbreakable. He had found what he'd been searching for, or so he thought. The early days of their marriage were everything Michael had hoped for. Danielle was attentive, affectionate, and deeply involved in their shared faith. They attended church together every Saturday, prayed together before meals, discussed scripture in the evenings. She seemed devoted not just to him, but to the life they were building. Michael felt blessed in a way he'd never experienced before. This was the reward, he thought, for staying faithful, for living righteously. God had given him a partner who understood him, who shared his values, who would walk beside him through whatever challenges life might bring. But beneath the surface, things were not as they seemed. Danielle had secrets, carefully guarded, meticulously hidden, and Michael, trusting and devoted, had no idea. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Michael was doing laundry one Saturday afternoon when he noticed a piece of clothing that didn't belong to him. It was a men's shirt, expensive, a brand he didn't own. He held it up, confused. "Danielle, whose is this?" he called out. She glanced at it, then shrugged. "Oh, that must be from the hospital. Sometimes patients leave things behind and we bring them home to wash." The explanation seemed reasonable. Michael nodded and moved on. But a few weeks later, there was cash. He found a stack of $100 bills tucked into Danielle's purse, far more than her nursing salary would account for in a single paycheck. When he asked about it, she hesitated for just a moment before saying it was from overtime shifts and a bonus she'd received. Again, Michael believed her. He had no reason not to. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, and doubt seemed like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. But the inconsistencies continued. Danielle began working late more frequently, sometimes not coming home until 2 or 3 in the morning. When Michael asked why her shifts were so long, she explained that the hospital was short-staffed, that she was picking up extra hours to help cover the gaps. Michael wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that the woman he'd married was exactly who she said she was. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He started noticing other things. Danielle's phone, which she used to leave lying around casually, was now always in her hand or her pocket. She changed her passcode. When he asked why, she laughed it off, saying she just wanted more privacy. Michael didn't push. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who interrogated his wife, who demanded access to every part of her life. That wasn't the marriage he wanted. But the doubt was growing, spreading like a shadow across everything he thought he knew. One night, Michael couldn't sleep. Danielle was out again, another late shift, she said, and the house felt too quiet, too empty. He got up, paced the living room, tried to distract himself with television, but his mind kept circling back to the same question. What if something was wrong? What if Danielle wasn't being honest? He hated the thought, hated himself for even entertaining it, but the evidence was piling up in ways he couldn't ignore. The clothes, the cash, the late nights, the secrecy around her phone. When Danielle finally came home that night, Michael was waiting at the kitchen table. She walked in looking tired, her hair pulled back, her scrubs slightly wrinkled. She stopped when she saw him. "Michael, what are you still doing up?" He looked at her, his expression serious. "We need to talk." What followed was a conversation that would change everything. Michael asked her directly about the late nights, about the cash, about the shirt he'd found. Danielle's demeanor shifted. She became defensive, then dismissive, then angry. She accused Michael of not trusting her, of being paranoid, of letting his past trauma cloud his judgment. She said the questions hurt her, that she'd never given him any reason to doubt her. Michael wanted to believe her. He wanted to let it go, to apologize for even asking. But something in her eyes, something in the way she deflected rather than answered, told him the truth was elsewhere. Over the following weeks, Michael began to investigate quietly. He didn't hire a private investigator or confront Danielle again. He simply paid attention. He noticed patterns. On nights when Danielle said she was working late, he'd call the hospital. Sometimes they'd confirm she was there. Other times the receptionist would say she'd left hours ago. Michael's heart sank. The woman he'd married, the woman who wore a rosary and attended church and spoke so beautifully about faith, was lying to him. One afternoon while Danielle was out, Michael went through her belongings. He hated doing it, felt like he was violating something sacred. But the need to know overpowered his guilt. In the back of her closet, hidden beneath a stack of old clothes, he found a second phone. It wasn't the one she carried with her every day. This one was older, a burner phone with no identifying information. Michael turned it on, his hands shaking. The messages that appeared on the screen shattered him. There were dozens of conversations with different men, explicit messages, arrangements to meet at motels, discussions about money. Danielle wasn't just unfaithful. She was living an entirely separate life. The woman Michael thought he knew, the devoted wife who prayed beside him and spoke so passionately about faith, didn't exist. Or perhaps she did exist, but only as one version of Danielle, one carefully curated persona designed to deceive him. The real Danielle, or at least another version of her, was someone else entirely. Michael confronted her that night. He placed the phone on the table between them and waited. Danielle looked at it, then at him, and for the first time she didn't try to explain. She didn't deny it. She just sat there silent, her expression unreadable. Michael asked her why. Why would she marry him if she was going to live like this? Why would she pretend to share his faith, his values, if none of it mattered to her? Danielle didn't have an answer, or if she did, she chose not to share it. The conversation ended without resolution. Michael told her to leave. She packed a bag and walked out, and that was the last time they lived under the same roof. But the story didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. Because Danielle's double life didn't just involve Michael. There were others, men who had no idea about each other, men whose lives were about to become entangled in a tragedy that none of them saw coming. One of those men was Dr. Thomas Reed, a respected physician in his mid-40s who specialized in internal medicine. Thomas had built a career on precision and trust. His patients relied on him, his colleagues respected him, and his reputation was spotless. He was married to a woman named Norah, and together they had 2 children. From the outside, the Reeds looked like the ideal family, stable, successful, grounded. But Thomas had a secret, one that would unravel everything he'd worked for. He met Danielle at the hospital where she worked. She wasn't assigned to his department, but they crossed paths occasionally in the cafeteria, in the hallways during shift changes. Danielle was charming, attentive, and she made Thomas feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. His marriage to Norah had grown distant. They coexisted more than they connected, their conversations limited to logistics about the kids, about bills, about schedules. Just a quiet erosion of intimacy that had left Thomas feeling isolated. Danielle noticed. She always noticed. She had a way of reading people, of identifying vulnerabilities and exploiting them with a smile. She started conversations with Thomas, casual at first, then more personal. She asked about his work, his stress, his life outside the hospital. Thomas, starved for connection, opened up, and Danielle listened. She was good at that, at making men feel like they mattered, like they were special. Before long, their conversations moved from the hospital to text messages, then to phone calls and eventually to meetings outside of work. Thomas convinced himself it was innocent, that they were just friends. But it wasn't innocent, and they both knew it. Within a few months, the relationship became physical. They met at motels, always discreet, always careful. Thomas felt guilty, but not guilty enough to stop. Danielle had a way of making him forget the life he was supposed to be living. What Thomas didn't know was that Danielle was seeing other men at the same time. She kept them separate, compartmentalized, each one believing he was the only one. She was skilled at managing multiple lives, at keeping her stories straight, at presenting exactly the version of herself that each man needed to see. To Michael, she was the devoted Christian wife. To Thomas, she was the compassionate confidant who understood his loneliness. To others, she was something else entirely. Danielle wasn't just unfaithful. She was strategic, calculating, and she had turned deception into a lifestyle. But no secret, no matter how carefully guarded, stays hidden forever. And when the truth began to surface, the consequences would be catastrophic. The unraveling began in early June of 2023. Michael, still reeling from the discovery of Danielle's double life, tried to move forward. He filed for divorce, seeking not just separation, but answers. He wanted to know the extent of her betrayal, wanted to understand how long it had been going on, who else was involved. His attorney advised him to document everything, to gather evidence, to prepare for a contentious legal battle. Michael complied, collecting text messages, bank statements, anything that might reveal the scope of Danielle's deception. What he found was staggering. Danielle had been involved with at least 5 different men over the course of their marriage, some relationships lasting months, others just brief encounters. She had accepted money from several of them, not as payment for sex explicitly, but as gifts that blurred the line between affair and transaction. Michael felt sick. The woman he'd married didn't exist. She'd been a fiction, a performance, and he'd been naive enough to believe it. But Michael wasn't the only one unraveling. Norah Reed, Thomas's wife, had begun to suspect something was wrong. Thomas had been distant, distracted, spending more time on his phone than he ever had before. He worked late more frequently, and when he came home he seemed exhausted, not from work but from something else, something he wouldn't talk about. Norah tried to confront him, but Thomas deflected, assuring her that everything was fine, that he was just stressed. But Norah knew her husband, and she knew when he was lying. One evening, while Thomas was in the shower, Norah went through his phone. What she found confirmed her worst fears. Messages to a woman named Danielle, explicit, intimate, unmistakable. Norah's hands trembled as she read them. She felt her world collapsing. The marriage she'd invested 2 decades in, the family they'd built, all of it had been a lie, and the woman on the other end of those messages was destroying it. Norah didn't confront Thomas immediately. She sat with the information, let it burn inside her, let the anger and humiliation fester. She started following him discreetly, carefully, documenting where he went, who he met. She discovered the motels, the lies, the extent of the betrayal, and she learned Danielle's full name, her address, her workplace. Norah began to obsess over this woman, this nurse who had so casually destroyed her family. She searched for Danielle online, found photos, learned about her life, and the more she learned, the more her anger grew. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about a woman who seemed to take pleasure in wrecking lives, who moved from one man to the next without consequence, who left devastation in her wake. Norah couldn't let it continue. She wouldn't let it continue. On the night of June 15th, 2023, Danielle left the hospital after her shift and drove to a motel on the outskirts of Phoenix. She'd been staying there intermittently since leaving Michael's house, using it as a base between relationships, between lives. She parked her car in the lot, walked toward her room, her mind already on the next day, the next plan. She didn't notice the silver Toyota Highlander parked several spaces away, its headlights off, its engine idling quietly. Inside the vehicle, Norah Reed sat gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her jaw clenched. She'd been waiting for hours, following Danielle's movements, planning her next step. This wasn't premeditated in the traditional sense. Norah hadn't written out a plan or prepared an alibi. But in that moment, watching Danielle walk casually toward her room as if she hadn't destroyed an entire family, Norah made a decision. She got out of the car, walked across the parking lot, and approached Danielle from behind. What happened next was brief and brutal. There was a confrontation, voices raised, accusations thrown. Witnesses later reported hearing a woman yelling, though no one could make out the words. Then there was a struggle, movement in the shadows, the sound of something metallic hitting pavement, and then silence. By the time the motel manager called the police, Danielle Lawson was dead. Her body was found in the alley behind the motel, face down, her nurse's scrubs stained with blood. She'd been stabbed multiple times, wounds that forensic examiners would later describe as frenzied, personal, driven by rage. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, nothing to suggest a random attack. This was targeted, deliberate, the work of someone who knew her, who hated her. The investigation began immediately. Detectives from the Phoenix Police Department arrived on the scene within 20 minutes, securing the area, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses. The motel's security cameras had malfunctioned weeks earlier and hadn't been repaired, so there was no footage of the parking lot. But investigators found Danielle's phone in her room, unlocked, filled with messages that painted a picture of a complicated, tangled life. There were conversations with Michael, angry texts demanding answers about the divorce, about money she claimed he owed her. There were messages with Thomas, affectionate, intimate, suggesting a relationship that was ongoing, and there were messages with other men, some investigators recognized as prominent figures in the community. Danielle's life, even in death, was a web of secrets. Detectives knew they had multiple suspects, multiple motives, and very little physical evidence to narrow the field. Michael Lawson was questioned first. He'd made no secret of his anger toward Danielle, had sent her dozens of texts in the weeks before her death, some of which could be interpreted as threatening. In one message he'd written, "You destroyed everything. You'll pay for what you did to me." Taken out of context, it sounded like a threat, but when detectives sat down with Michael, they found a man who was broken, not vengeful. He was undergoing treatment for HIV, a diagnosis he'd received just weeks after discovering Danielle's affairs. The disease had been transmitted to him by his wife, a woman he'd trusted completely, a woman who had lied about everything. Michael was devastated, physically and emotionally. When detectives asked him about the night of Danielle's death, he had an alibi. He'd been at a support group meeting, surrounded by witnesses who confirmed his presence. His DNA was found in Danielle's motel room, but that was explainable. He'd been there weeks earlier, confronting her, trying to get answers. The DNA wasn't fresh, wasn't connected to the night of the murder. After hours of questioning, detectives cleared him. Michael Lawson was angry, yes, but he wasn't a killer. Norah Reed was next. His relationship with Danielle was undeniable, his motive clear. A man with a career and a family had everything to lose if the affair became public. Detectives theorized that perhaps Thomas had tried to end things, that Danielle had threatened to expose him, that he'd panicked and acted. But Thomas's alibi was solid. On the night of June 15th, he'd been at home with his family, watching a movie, tucking his kids into bed. His wife Norah confirmed it. His children confirmed it. There was no gap in the timeline, no window during which he could have driven to the motel, killed Danielle, and returned home unnoticed. Forensic analysis of his car showed no traces of blood, no evidence that he'd been near the crime scene. Like Michael, Thomas was cleared, though his life was now in ruins. His affair was public knowledge, his marriage shattered, his reputation destroyed. Even without charges, he'd lost everything. For weeks, the investigation stalled. Detectives pursued dozens of leads, interviewed over 50 people connected to Danielle's life, and found nothing conclusive. The case began to attract media attention, headlines calling it the double life murder, speculating about the men in Danielle's orbit, about secrets and lies and betrayal. Reporters camped outside the homes of suspects, demanding answers, fueling public outrage. But behind the scenes, investigators were frustrated. They had suspects with motives but no physical evidence. They had theories but no proof. And then, almost by chance, the case broke open. A truck driver who'd parked near the motel that night contacted police. He'd been reviewing footage from his dash cam, a camera he kept running to document his routes, and noticed something unusual. The footage showed the motel parking lot in the background, faint but visible. There were headlights, movement, shadows. Detectives enhanced the video frame by frame until they could make out details. A silver SUV pulling into the lot. A woman stepping out, waiting, then approaching someone near the alley. A brief struggle, flashes of movement, and then the woman returning to the SUV alone, clutching something in her hand. The license plate was partially visible, enough for investigators to run a search. The vehicle was registered to Norah Reed. When detectives confronted Thomas with the footage, he was stunned. "That's my wife's car," he whispered, disbelief written across his face. He'd spent weeks in custody, accused of a crime he didn't commit while the real killer had been living under his roof. Norah was arrested within 48 hours. A search warrant was executed at the Reed home, and investigators found the clothes she'd worn that night, hidden in the back of her closet, still stained with blood. When confronted, Norah didn't deny it. She looked the lead detective in the eye and said calmly, "I did what needed to be done. She ruined everything I had. I wasn't going to let her keep living while we paid for her mistakes." The confession was chilling in its simplicity. There were no tears, no attempts to shift blame. Norah's demeanor stunned even seasoned investigators. During her taped confession, she explained that it wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about ending something that never should have started. When asked if she regretted killing Danielle, She paused before saying, "No, I regret that I let her live long enough to hurt so many people." Prosecutors had everything they needed: the dash cam footage, the physical evidence, the confession. Norah Reed was charged with first-degree murder. The trial took place in December of 2023. The courtroom was packed, journalists and spectators filling every seat, eager to hear the details of a case that had captivated the public for months. Norah's defense attorney argued that she'd acted in a moment of emotional distress, that years of betrayal and humiliation had driven her to a breaking point. But prosecutors painted a different picture. This wasn't a crime of passion, they argued. Norah had followed Danielle, had waited for hours, had chosen the moment to act. It was calculated, deliberate, an execution driven by pride and rage. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Judge Helena Ortiz, in her sentencing remarks, described the act as cold and calculated, a crime that destroyed multiple lives and left no room for mercy. Norah was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read, simply looked at the floor and said quietly, "At least now she can't hurt anyone else." In the aftermath, the lives left behind struggled to find footing. Thomas Reed moved away from Arizona, seeking anonymity in a small town up north. His medical license was suspended pending review, and most of his patients had moved on. In his final statement to reporters, he said quietly, "I lost my wife, my career, and my name. But the truth had to come out, no matter the cost." As for Michael Lawson, he disappeared from public view entirely. Former colleagues said he quit his job and relocated, leaving no forwarding address. He never spoke of Danielle again, never granted interviews, never sought closure in any public way. The man who had once believed that love could be pure, that faith could guide a person through anything, now lived in the shadow of betrayal, his health compromised, his trust shattered. The case left behind questions that may never be answered. How had Danielle managed to deceive so many people for so long? What drove her to live such a fractured existence, moving between identities, between lives, without apparent guilt or consequence? Psychologists who analyzed the case suggested she may have exhibited traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by a lack of empathy, a talent for manipulation, and a disregard for the harm caused to others. But Danielle never faced trial, never had to answer for her actions, and so the full truth of who she was and why she lived the way she did remains unknowable. What is certain is that her double life didn't just destroy her own existence. It shattered families, ended careers, and led directly to a murder that sent one woman to prison for the rest of her life. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individuals involved. It raises uncomfortable questions about trust, about the versions of ourselves we present to others, about how well we can ever truly know the people closest to us. Michael Lawson thought he knew his wife. He believed they shared values, beliefs, a commitment to living righteously. But Danielle had simply been performing, showing him the version of herself he needed to see while living an entirely different reality elsewhere. Thomas Reed thought he was having a private affair, a secret relationship that wouldn't touch the rest of his life. But secrets have a way of spreading, of infecting everything they touch, and his decision to pursue Danielle cost him his marriage, his career, his reputation. And Norah Reed, driven by rage and betrayal, made a choice that ended one life and destroyed her own. There are no winners in this story, only victims. The prosecutor said it best during closing arguments. There are no winners in this case, only victims. A woman is dead, a husband is devastated, a lover's life is ruined, and a jealous wife will spend the rest of her days behind bars. Betrayal doesn't just break hearts, it breaks lives. The dashcam footage that solved the case, that haunting, grainy video of shadows and movement, was played one final time in court, a reminder of how one act of violence can ripple outward, destroying everything in its path. In the end, the story of Michael and Danielle Lawson is a chilling true story of deception, crime investigation, and consequences that went far beyond one marriage. What began as a union built on faith and trust ended in tragedy, proof that even the most carefully constructed facades can crumble, revealing the dark history hidden beneath. This real crime documentary serves as a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing, often too late to prevent the devastation it leaves behind.